On April 27, 1865, the American steamship Sultana exploded on the Mississippi River near Memphis, Tennessee. The explosion is believed to have been from a mix of overcrowding and poor mechanical maintenance. Nearly 1,195 out of the 2,200 people on board were killed, making the sinking of the Sultana the worst maritime disaster in the history of the United States. The event also occurred during the ending chaos of the American Civil War. This is the story of the steamship Sultana disaster. In the early half of the 19th century, the British Empire began to experiment with steam power for transportation. Steam power was far more powerful than horseback. This breakthrough began to replace most of transportation such as horse-drawn carriages and sails for ships. Steam power also began to be used in factories and shops to speed up work functions. Steamboats became popular modes of transportation. Large wooden ships could be built with steam engines that could carry more people and cargo. In the United States, steamships became a dependable form of transportation, especially in the American South. Large wooden ships would steam up and down the many rivers, creeks, and bayous along the Mississippi River Delta. During the American Civil War, riverboats carried soldiers and equipment up and down the river towards war zones in port cities such as New Orleans. Riverboats would become a symbol of the antebellum South, identified by their two slender black smokestacks, white wooden hull, and its massive red paddle wheel for propulsion. During the Civil War, hundreds of steamships were used to ferry soldiers and freight up and down the Mississippi River. As the war began to end, many hoped that the steamboats would once again be returned to civilian use. One of these boats was the Sultana. Built in 1863, the Sultana measured 260 feet long and weighed 1,719 tons, with a crew of 83 and a capacity to carry 376 passengers. The Sultana was constructed mostly out of wood and was designed to be used to carry cotton. The steamship made constant trips between New Orleans, Louisiana, and St. Louis, Missouri. On April 13, 1865, the Sultana left St. Louis bound for New Orleans. The ship was captained by James Case Mason. The ship briefly berthed in the town of Cairo, Illinois, when the news of President Abraham Lincoln's assassination reached the town. Mason decided to pick up some newspapers detailing the incident. Next, the Sultana then docked in Vicksburg, Mississippi, when Captain Mason was bribed to take on a large contingent of recently freed Union troops from a nearby Confederate prison. The U.S. government would pay steamboat captains money to return any Union soldiers and officers back to the North. Mason needed the money, and he soon took around 14,000 Union troops. The Sultana's maximum capacity was 376 passengers. Eventually, the Sultana would take on more prisoners until she carried a total of 2,130 people, making the ship dangerously overloaded and overcrowded. The overcrowding was so bad that the wooden supports of the ship began to creak and sag from the weight, making groaning noises that could be heard throughout the ship. In addition to the overloading, the Sultana also had to struggle upstream and was experiencing boiler and mechanical issues. On April 26th, the last stop for the Sultana was the town of Helena, Arkansas. While docked there, a local photographer named William W. Banks took a photo of the grossly overloaded vessel. A mechanic was soon summoned to fix the Sultana's boilers. The mechanic wanted Captain Mason to put the ship in the dock for repairs. Mason protested this, however, stating that any further delay would cause the prisoners to be transferred to other boats, which would cause Mason to lose the money. Mason then ordered the mechanic to make a rather improvised patch-up to the boiler's seam. This meant that the boilers wouldn't be able to handle the added steam pressure loads. By this time, the Sultana was in the vicinity of Memphis, Tennessee. At 2 o'clock in the morning on April 27, 1865, and just 7 miles outside of Memphis, Tennessee, the Sultana was ripped apart by several massive explosions. The ship's failing boilers all exploded one by one. The massive explosions streamed upward at a 45-degree angle, destroying everything in its path, including the pilot house, which controlled the ship's steering. The Sultana then became a burning, uncontrollable hulk of wood. The forward half of the upper deck collapsed into the middeck, killing and trapping many. Both smokestacks also collapsed. The explosion blew many in the water. The burning wreck of the Sultana then drifted 6 miles before sinking at 7 a.m. near the town of Marion, Arkansas. Rescue efforts soon began as warships and other steamships began to rescue survivors from the water. While some were plucked from the water, many died in the frigid Mississippi River from hypothermia and drowning. Many bodies drifted downstream afterwards and were found months later, but many of the bodies were never recovered or identified. Captain Mason and many of the officers also perished in the tragedy. The exact death toll was never fully known, but it's believed that nearly 1,169 people died in the disaster. Due to the chaos of the ending Civil War and the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, the news of the Sultana disaster made little headlines. An investigation of the disaster indicated that the poor state of the boilers and the fact that the ship was horribly overcrowded played a role in the disaster. The Sultana's boilers were all interconnected and placed side by side. Due to the Sultana listing severely to one side as it navigated twists and turns on the river, the water levels in the Sultana's boilers would sometimes slosh to one side of the boiler, exposing red-hot burning coals. Once the ship righted itself, the water would then smother the hot coals, releasing a massive amounts of steam. The massive pressure from the sudden increase of steam blew apart the faulty and poorly maintained boilers, destroying the ship in the process. Boiler explosions were fairly common during this time period, and nearly 7,000 people died from them. Had the Sultana properly fixed the boilers and not been so overweight and had more water in the boilers themselves, the disaster might not have happened. No one was ever held accountable for the Sultana disaster. Captain Mason was ultimately held accountable for overloading the ship, yet he was killed in the ensuing explosion. No one else was held accountable for America's worst maritime disaster. Despite the horror of the explosion and the death toll, very few Americans have ever heard of the Sultana tragedy.